The regulatory environment for medical devices in the United States is going to go through a major transformation when the Quality Management System Regulation or QMSR goes into effect. Now, we have been talking about this for the last 2 years, but I think it's only now that people have started paying attention to it. And because of that, on Let's Talk Risk, we are going to focus on QMSR transition and QMSR readiness in the next few weeks. Hi, everyone. I'm Naveen Agarwal, and welcome again to another special session of our Let's Talk Risk podcast. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome my guest, Ashkon Rasooli. He has many years of industry experience in many roles, large companies, small companies, but mostly focusing on the SAMD and AI ML space when it comes to quality management systems. So I'm really very excited to hear his perspective about what it might take these companies to be ready for QMSR. With that, Ashkan, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Dr. Naveen.
Okay, so Ashkan, let's start by talking about a little bit your experience with SAMD and AI ML space predominantly, and what you have observed from a quality management system point of view, some of the practices that might be in these organizations versus organizations which are predominantly hardware based. Can you help us compare and contrast these two scenarios?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, for those of you in the audience that do not find software in their day-to-day life a big part of the medical devices you work on, I think it's important to understand the differences between software products and hardware products by nature, which then translate to quality management system requirements. There is a big difference between software and hardware in that software is considered to be deterministic in behavior, unlike hardware. What that means is software is expected to continue to behave because it is a piece of code, it is logic, to behave a certain way once tested versus hardware where you've got statistical sampling plans. Now, this one simple point ends up having a big cascade effect in design of a quality management system. For example, it is expected that when you're doing your risk management, assume that the software, if it's got a bug, it's going to fail 100% of the time. Whereas when you're doing risk management on a hardware and mechanical product, you're going to find likelihoods attached to the failure rates based on your inspections and all that. The other difference between software and hardware is that software has infinite logical complexity. When you've got a hardware mechanical product, you've got a finite number of critical to quality considerations there, and you focus on those, and there are a number of ways in which those can fail. When you talk about thousands of lines of code and even more lines of code that you depend upon that you didn't develop yourself. And what you're talking about there is an understanding that there are very many different ways in which this product can fail if you look at it from the code level. And so you're going to need different strategies to do risk management. You're going to need to do abstractions, architectures, detailed design. And it is understood, medical device or not, within the software community, that once you've got the old paradigm used to be if you do more than 1,000 lines of code, you're definitely going to have bugs there. There's no such thing as bug-free software. It is understood that you're going to have bugs in the software. And so when you're talking about designing a quality management system for software products, what you are understanding is I am lining up a series of quality assurance activities that mitigate step by step the likelihood of the bugs making it to production. You are not going to eliminate the bugs. And this is important to understand from a regulatory quality standpoint, because chasing bug-free product can eventually put you in the territory of unreasonable burden on the product release, and eventually depriving patients of product that is adequately safe and effective actually making it to the market. The other important difference between software and hardware is what we call the Agile mentality. This comes from outside the medical device, the software development community. The idea that a lot of times we find product market fit by going out to the market, getting feedback, and iterating on a product. We're only going to have a minimally viable product as a first revision, and then we're going to start building the product in increments, often releases that, they could even be daily. We could have daily updates. But, the most typical is bi-weekly or monthly updates to the product based on the feedback we get. One of the famous clashes between quality and engineering people in the software space is over trying to implement this agile mentality, because on the one hand, you want to iterate on your product continuously, which is a lot of change. On the other hand, the point of a quality management system is to have control on the different aspects of product development so your product continues to meet the intended use, continues to meet customer requirements. And so Agile, by definition, is about rapid releasing. Controlled, by
Mhm.
definition, is about hold on, slow
Mhm.
down. I want to make sure that you don't move too fast. And so this is the classic clash between the two. And so this is what you're going to hear is the number one concern in a medical device that is software heavy, software as a medical device, but also software in a medical device between the teams. It is important to look at the original Agile manifesto.
Mhm.
This is non-medical device specific. This was a manifesto developed in the early days of software becoming mainstream. And it had 4 principles. And I'll read the principles out to you, and you'll see
Mhm.
why it didn't quite work with medical devices. The first one's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Obviously, we have actual regulation asking for processes. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Again, documentation, big important part of quality management system and control. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and that one actually aligns, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, there is an ethos captured in this. However, the implementation of that ethos in a non-medical device setting looks very different
Mhm.
to medical device settings. I've worked at, tech-minded companies, big tech companies, the background, the underlying principle is move fast and break things. And the
Mhm.
reason that works is because the breaking of things has less consequences than in the medical device industry.
Mhm.
So the benefits of moving fast outweigh the harms of breaking things. So,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
risk management, we often talk about the benefit risk analysis, and this is a
Yeah.
classic benefit risk analysis, right? The benefit of moving fast means you can quickly respond to customer needs, you can quickly respond to customer feedback, fix all the bugs, fix all the security issues. And if in the process you break things 10 times a month, no harm, no foul, if you've got a photo sharing app or like a web search engine or something like that, you lose money, but nobody's going to die. You can't carry that over to a medical device setting where breaking things means patient harm, right?
Yeah.
Anywhere and
Yeah.
up to and including death.
Yeah.
So that's the original Agile manifesto, and as you can see, doesn't quite fit with the medical device setting, which is why I came up with my own.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, Ashkan. But what you are describing to me really, in my view, not in contradiction with what good quality principles are to begin with. I mean, if you look at ISO 13485, it tells you to have a risk based decision making process across your quality management systems. The way I'm looking at the current situation, which, by the way, everybody knows it now, but let me reinforce that QMSR is foundationally based on ISO 13485 requirements. And I think that's going to be a very big change in the mindset that FDA is expecting from manufacturers. But we'll talk about that in another episode. For now, I don't see a contradiction. What I do see is an opportunity here to bring the best of both worlds in a way that is situation specific, application specific, and works in that environment. There is no doubt in my mind that in today's world, we have to move fast. There is no option. It is possible to move fast and move accurately and precisely in the right direction. Look at how Kipchoge runs a marathon. Okay. You can be fast and you can have endurance over the long distance. It is possible, but what it means, we must have discipline and we must have systemic capabilities, nurture the systemic capability. So, in that context, let's set the stage. Let's set the stage in terms of your understanding of what might be some of the unique challenges in getting ready for QMSR for some of these SAMD dominant companies.
Well, 100%. I want to build on what you were just saying, which is the ethos of the Agile Manifesto is not in contradiction with quality system regulations or anything like that. It's just how the actual words have been interpreted. And so this is why I translated to my own non-BS manifesto specifically to actually address what you were saying, which is the ethos here is that we want quality, we don't want proceduralism. And that became one of my first principles, right?
Yeah.
Where the other ethos is that we want culture over mandate. The requirement for being able to achieve both quality and speed is going to be establishing an infrastructure, and that infrastructure includes a culture. And it is a shared responsibility between the engineering released fast part of the organization as well as the regulatory quality part of the organization, that we need to basically come to an agreement that they're both important. And I've spoken to both teams. My background is unique in that I've actually held those positions. I've done engineering, I've done development, I've actually done product management, but then I've also done regulatory and quality, and so I very well understand the perspectives. In the same way that I speak to engineering teams about the intent of quality management system regulations and how we want to maintain quality, in the same way I talk to regulatory quality team about how the risk that is often not captured on your risk matrix is the risk of unnecessarily delaying product launch. You are denying treatment. This is a form of delayed treatment by a product that is adequately safe and effective. And therefore, as you are weighing in whether this particular risk can be mitigated even further or whatever, you got to also balance it against that, balance it against whether by not taking it in. And this applies to this whole QMSR transition thing as well. I will say, I think, again, speaking to the intent and the ethos of the regulation, QSR and 1345 overlapped majorly. If I had to put a number to it, 85, 90% even, in terms of the ethos of it. Obviously, there were ways in which either one was a little more prescriptive in different areas when it came to the actual implementation of that ethos. But I say this to, I think, echo what you were just saying, which is if you were already an organization that was quality minded, had a culture of quality, regardless of whether your compliance was monitored to the CFRs or 1345, you would find yourself basically implementing the exact same processes for SAMD. But I think specifically, your question was, okay, I'm a SAMD company. I've been only focusing on 21 CFRs, the QSRs. Now this QMSR transition's happened. What should I worry about, right? I think that's what your question was. Yeah, and the word of the day on this is going to be risk. I think when you look at the changes and specifically narrow it down to changes that are applicable to SAMD, the common thread across all of that ends up being risk. And a couple important notes on that. One is risk when it comes to software has explicitly been defined as more than just safety. It also now includes security harm, things like data loss, data integrity. So the risk of all that. But more importantly, the transition from the old QSR and now to the QMSR has more explicitly put an emphasis on the integration of it in your entirety of your SDLC or software development lifecycle. Now, the way this is even going to manifest more concretely is going to be in supplier management, software development lifecycle design, but also tool validation, combined with the fact that the FDA also now has cybersecurity mandates. You're going to see risk overall be a lot more visible in the process of software development, but you're also going to see cybersecurity just be non-negotiable, specifically cybersecurity in the software development lifecycle. So, the classic paradigm of having security be an independent organization is over. I don't think anyone can do that. It is extremely inefficient and it is bound to fail. You are going to have to integrate cybersecurity and quality management system for software as a medical device.
Yeah. So that means it has implication for your organizational design, implications for the kind of people you hire, implications on the work practices and the culture you establish. But your emphasis on risk is, I think, spot on. And I have a feeling, here's just my gut. Let me hear from you what you think is that under the QSR, the way FDA writes warning letters or cites the findings is, in my view, very limited when it comes to the language of risk. They might cite evidence which is rooted in the problems with the risk management system, but they can't really use that as an official finding because it doesn't exist in the QSR. However, if you read 13485, risk is explicitly mentioned in many different places and not in an isolated manner, but in an interconnected manner. I have a feeling, a hunch, that FDA might start, and I don't know whether they will do this or not because the updated QSIT is also not out. We are waiting for that, see how it goes. But reading the tea leaves, I can see that FDA might be able to use a more explicit language when they find a problem in your QMS and link it directly to deficiencies in your risk management process. Does that sound like I'm imagining things, or it sounds reasonable that it might happen in the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we're speculating, but I think I speculate the same, and I think you're spot on with that. Obviously, the inspection team is now undergoing training, and it is interesting to see how the findings start to be written post February 2nd. And if I had to guess, though, I would think you're going to see a lot more direct risk-based decision making findings across the board across different
Mm.
systems. You know, one of the things that ISO 1345 explicitly asks for is in your tool validation and your supplier qualification and your CAPAs and all that, that you show a risk-based decision making, risk-based assessment of when to close it and all that. And you're going to have to show that a lot more clearly. And you're
Mhm.
going to have FDA level inspection to that now. Because FDA inspects differently from a notified body. So even if you did
Yes.
have a 1345 cert before and you did have compliance to that, you are now going to be audited to that by a very different kind of inspector,
Yeah.
right? And so you got to be ready for that.
Yep. And let me also share with you another thought I have on this is that the observation about capabilities in risk management is not just limited to review of documentation. It
Mhm.
can also extend to how actually people do the work, how decisions are being made. So it's not sufficient to just make pretty pictures, write long procedures, stepwise directions, but make sure that the practice of risk is there, it's clear, and it's sort of seen very clearly by anybody when they talk to people or when they review your records that yeah, the practice of risk is mature enough and not just in the procedures. And I think that is where I do believe there's an opportunity to apply the agile mindset. Our QMS
Yes.
has to be nimble and our QMS has to be effective in practice. So I would say let's not get too hung up on drawing pretty pictures and creating multi-page procedures. Let's make sure that we write it in a way which is simple and easy to understand and people can practice. So let's invest a little bit more in the practice of risk management and not just proceduralizing the whole thing. Does that sound like it? First of all, does it sound reasonable? And second question is, I think it stands in a little bit of a contrast to the current practice where we are so focused on writing everything in the procedure. How can we overcome that? Any thoughts on that?
100%. I mean, you're kind of touching base on that first principle I talked about of quality over proceduralism. It is less important that things are written down in procedure and more important that you're actually focusing on quality, because what is required to focus on quality is that everyone understands the intent. What is my intent of having, for example, a product development process, a risk management process, a CAPA process? What is the intent behind that? And what role do you play as a manufacturing technician, as a head of software engineering, as purchasing and finance? What role do you play in that bigger process? Because once you understand those two things, regardless of how detailed the procedure is or not, you're gonna at least put on your best decision-making hat, your risk-based hat. I will say this is incumbent upon quality teams, possibly regulatory teams, to come up with a clear guidance on risk-based decision making.
Hmm.
We obviously are familiar with severity levels related to patient harm, but we also need that for quality management system risks,
Mhm.
compliance risk. We need to have these matrices clearly defined and communicated to everyone and make sure everyone understands. And I don't have anything against or for pictures in that, as long as the ultimate intent of people understanding the role and the process is met. Sometimes people are visual and they understand with a pretty picture, so I would fully
Mhm.
support that. But that is basically what I would focus on, and maybe even verify that with some training effectiveness verification measures, making sure that people understand what this QMS thing is about.
Yeah. Uh, it seems to me that we'll definitely have to become very nimble and also continuously monitoring our QMS and updating it and revising it and improving it, just as we would do to the product itself. We do so many design changes, we do so many software code updates and releases. On the product side, we do a lot, but on the quality side, in fact, we are quite resistant to that change. So I have a feeling that we'll have to become quite nimble at observing where the problems are. And so I don't think we can rely only on routinely scheduled internal audits, but more like observations of practice. Here's an idea that I've been thinking about, that instead of thinking about internal audits, we should think about observation of practice and understand where the gaps sit and how to fix those. So, the bottom line here it really is that we may have to change a lot in how we do things. What is our operational mechanism of the QMS? Not just how it is documented, but how we are practicing it. And to me, it will be even more important in the SAMD dominant space where the change comes so fast, and especially in AI ML, where we know we are going to have to think about predetermined change control plans or how it's going to update and how it's going to modify in the future. We're going to be very proactive about that. So let's talk about that a little bit. What might it take? And you can reflect upon your career also. You have such a distinguished career. I'm sure you have picked up many different capabilities and experiences. What would a future QA/RA medical affairs professional might look like? Not just having a piece of degree behind them, but in practice, what would that look like?
This is something that is not even exclusive to the future. It is something that would be required today. The future RAQA person, to your point, would have to actually look at the quality management system in the same way we look at a product that we give to an end user. It is a product with internal users. And in the same way that with a product you sell, you do post-market surveillance, even if you're not a regulated device, you have surveys and you try to be open to feedback and you do voice of customer activities to fine tune the idea you have and address more of the market need. In the exact same way, you've got to be open to the QMS as your product, you as a regulatory quality team being updated. There are multiple inputs that go into the QMS design, the QMS architecture. There are obviously geographical regulations. Everybody knows that. But then there is product design and then business realities like the business model, business initiatives. And you got to put all three of that together and say, what is the best quality management system for me right now? And the thing is, over the lifetime of the business, all three are going to change. And you are going to have to monitor all three inputs and then also ask the internal users, your actual end users of the quality management stuff, hey, is this working for you?
Yeah.
And if not, talk to them. Now, I will say, not being delusional in the fact that there are always going to be a baseline level of dissatisfaction with having to do anything quality, because quality by nature requires slowing things down, doing a little bit of control, it is additional work versus not. This is not to negate on the original point of that we could be fast and also have quality, but the reality is to do fast and quality is more work than to just do fast. And so people are always going to be resistant at a baseline level. But in my personal experience, the very same people are far less resistant when they are part of the conversation in designing the quality management system. The conversation where you go and say you gotta do this because law is completely less effective and efficient for that matter versus the conversation of, listen, here's what we're trying to accomplish here. How do we do it? Here's my idea. My idea is, here's what the process looks like. What do you think? And I will tell you, on many occasions, I've walked out of a meeting with a much better QMS process because of the input non-QMS people gave me than I would have by myself. And so that's what we're going to have to look like. The requirements for that are also going to be that we got regulatory quality professionals that can speak a little more technically. I have found it extremely useful in my career that I understood the technicalities of software development. It very much facilitated those conversations. But that is what the regulatory quality profession should look like. We need to go more and more towards that.
Wonderful. There are so many insights packed in there, Ashkan. I want to just take a moment to identify a couple of key points for everybody. You mentioned something very interesting to me. We said we have to start treating our QMS as a product which serves a set of customers, which means we need to have voice of customers. We need to constantly measure their satisfaction level, and we need to be inclusive and not be seen as a traffic cop. This will require, I think, a big mindset change from our colleagues. But on the other side, they will also say that, we also need a cultural change. And I think both will have to go hand in hand. Individuals have to go a certain way, and the culture has to also go a certain way. So great. So Ashkan, in the remaining time, I want to pivot a little bit and talk to you a little bit about ingenious solutions that you have launched very recently. Tell us a little bit more about that. And I'm particularly curious to hear the backstory behind how you position yourself as a non BS QMS strategist. And I can certainly tell the way you talk about things, but how does it get practiced in your business today as you engage with clients and try to solve their problems?
Yeah, so my background was focused entirely on products with software. This could be software in a medical device or software as a medical device. And Engineer Solutions were kind of born out of a passion I have for fixing the very broken healthcare system we have in the United States, but also realizing through my background what significant role technology can play in fixing some of those problems. And I am by no means saying that technology is going to be by itself enough of a solution to all the problems we have, but it could play a significant role. And the other realizations I had through my career was a lot of the potential benefits we can get from technology in the healthcare system are unnecessarily burdened and unnecessarily delayed for a number of reasons. And one of them was the day-to-day challenges of managing regulatory quality uh, in a system where you've got a good point of perspective is to compare the state of technology in a non-regulated industry versus a regulated industry. And this is by no means, obviously, as a quality professional to shun regulations, but there for a very good reason. But when you see the gap in the speed adoption, then it makes you think, is this gap necessary? And the question becomes, what can I do to minimize the gap? And, again, industry without risk, industry with risk, you're always going to have necessarily a little bit of a gap. But
Mhm.
what can I do given my particular knowledge and background to minimize that? And so out of that idea, Ingenious Solutions was born. The non-BS manifesto kind of guides everything I do in that we are there to ensure quality, ensure safety, effectiveness, and reliability of a product, and at the same time, do it in a manner that does not delay treatment, does not delay bringing innovation to market. That itself is a risk that we gotta understand and acknowledge. The consulting really just focuses on, the software subsegment of medical devices. How can I best starting from a concept all the way to commercialization and then post-market surveillance, streamline that process on the quality regulatory side. And so we offer services in that area.
Oh, wonderful, Ashkan. I'm so happy to hear this from you. Certainly a fresh perspective that we need, a fresh approach to serving the technology based innovation. And your perspective is so insightful to me that delaying innovation to market in the service of patients and doctors itself is a risk that we should not ignore. And a single day that is lost is one less patient served, maybe. Right. So we need to be mindful of that. And I can't wait to hear more about the kind of problems you will solve. And hopefully, we'll have you back on the show in a year from now or so. And maybe you can share with us some interesting perspectives and case studies of the problems you will solve. But I want to thank you again for coming to the show, Ashkan, and wish you all the success ahead.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to being back on the show.